Hello and welcome to the next installment of Shani Reads Call of the Wild. This is assignment 13, chapter 6, part 1. So our standards, as always, we are looking to see how dialogue and events propel the action, reveal the character, and specifically we are looking at that character development through our theme of Buck becoming wilder throughout the story. At this point, he's going to continue that journey into being wild. However, he's really content with John Thornton at this point and kind of starts to suppress that. You're going to analyze the relationship between Buck and John Thornton, and you're going to be answering questions using details from the text as always. So what happened last time as a refresher? So if you remember, Charles, Hal, and Mercedes had the dog sled team. Those were the city dwellers who were completely inept and could not do anything correctly because they were too stubborn to really listen or figure it out. So they run the dogs down, and their food gets so low that the dogs start starving, and many of them die off or must be killed, sadly. When the dogs finally get a chance to rest, at Thornton's camp, when they pop in to ask for directions and to brag, Buck doesn't get up again when the group is ready to go. He has that feeling that something bad is going to happen. He refuses to get up. Hal whips him mercilessly, and Buck doesn't care anymore. He has stopped caring about a man with a club in his hand. Um, and when Thornton sees that Buck is just getting beaten badly, he steps in and he takes Buck right from the group. He takes him out of the traces, and after that, the rest of the group leaves, and Thornton and Buck watch them all fall through the melting ice and drown. And that's the ice that they were bragging that people said they shouldn't run on it, and they made it all this way running on the ice anyway. And then their pride gets the better of them, and they completely go through, unfortunately, killing the rest of the team with them. All right, so we're going to look at this section. Basically, we're going to see how Buck bonds with John Thornton in a way that he has never bonded with another human in his life, even the judge. So we need to look at this idea, why do dogs and humans bond in such a strong way? So we're going to watch this video to find out.
For all the pet lovers who have insisted their dog somehow understands emotionally what they're saying and feeling, a new study shows you may be right. ABC's Lindsay Janis on proof of a connection with your best friend.
Ask any dog owner and they'll tell you their best friend seems to understand them in a way no other pet could. On YouTube, thousands of dogs entertaining and comforting us. Check out these dog owners pretending to cry. Now watch as their four-legged friends run over and try to cheer them up. Tonight, scientists say there's a reason humans and dogs get along so beautifully. Dogs might understand when we're happy and when we're sad because they hear emotion in our voices, the same way that humans do.
Meaning when I'm happy, Ace here really does know it. Same goes for when I'm sad.
Here's how researchers in Hungary figured it out. First, they trained dogs like Maya here to lie completely still in an MRI machine for up to 8 minutes. Then they conducted the first ever comparison between the brains of humans and dogs, putting headphones on both while exposing them to the same sounds: crying, whining, laughter. Look at our brains side by side. The same areas active in humans, also active in dogs.
They have a sensitivity to some of the same things that we do, including someone who is experiencing strong emotion. And that does mark them as quite different from other animals.
Scientists think it might be because we've grown up together. They say dogs and humans have been buddies for over 30,000 years. Maybe that's why we just get each other. Lindsay Janis, ABC News, New York.
All right, and those of you who have dogs may have experienced situations like these. I have known dogs that if you pretend to hit the person who they are most closely tied to, they will become very protective and bark and try to, step in and protect that person. So I've seen this in action, and some of you may have even seen this human dog bond in action. So now that you have finished watching this video, we are going to continue on and read through chapter 6, part 1. When you're finished, as always, you are going to use the text details to answer questions on your Schoology quiz, and please use the race format on the short answers. All right, now we're going to continue on with chapter 6, part 1, For the Love of a Man. When John Thornton froze his feet in the previous December, his partners made him comfortable and left him to get well, going on themselves up the river to get out a raft of saw logs for Dawson. He was still limping slightly at the time he rescued Buck, but with the continued warm weather even the slight limp left him. And here, lying by the river bank through the long spring days, watching the running water, listening lazily to the songs of birds and the hum of nature, Buck slowly won back his strength. All right, so because Thornton got frostbite before we met him in the story, he was around when Buck needed him and was around to help him. So they are here basically healing together. They are sharing this experience, healing and recuperating. A rest comes very good after one has traveled 3,000 miles, and it must be confessed that Buck's waxed lazy as his wounds healed, his muscles swelled out, and the flesh came back to cover his bones. For that matter, they were all loafing, Buck, John Thornton, and Skeet and Nig, waiting for the raft to come that was to carry them down to Dawson. Skeet was a little Irish setter who early made friends with Buck, who in a dying condition was unable to resent her first advances. She had the doctor trait, which some dogs possess, and as a mother cat washes her kittens, so she washed and cleansed Buck's wounds. Regularly each morning, after he had finished his breakfast, she performed her self-appointed task, till he came to look for her ministrations as much as he did for Thornton's. Nig, equally friendly, though less demonstrative, was a huge black dog, half bloodhound and half deerhound, with his eyes that laughed and a boundless good nature. To Buck's surprise, these dogs manifested no jealousy toward him, seemed to share the kindliness and largeness of John Thornton. As Buck grew stronger, they enticed him into all sorts of ridiculous games, in which Thornton himself could not forbear to join, and in this fashion Buck romped through his convalescence and into a new existence. Love, genuine, passionate love, was his for the first time. This he had never experienced at Judge Miller's down in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. With the judge's sons hunting and tramping, it had been a working partnership, with the judge's grandsons a sort of pompous guardianship, and with the judge himself a stately and dignified friendship, but love that was feverish and burning, that was adoration, that was madness, it had taken John Thornton to arouse. All right, so we have the two new dogs, Skeet and Nig. Don't read too much into some of the names here. So basically, he's able to bond with these dogs because they're not fighting for supremacy or fighting for their lives. They're domestic dogs. And Skeet especially takes on that kind of nurse role towards Buck, and she basically, cleans his wounds for him. And every morning, whether he wants it or not, she goes and she takes care of him. And he's too ill and tired and, beaten down by all the previous stuff to really care or to push her away. So for the first time in his life, no one wants anything from him except his happiness. And because of that, Buck now really loves John Thornton. All right. He cares for him. He cares what happens to him. He will become very protective of him. And he will bond with him like he has bonded with no person before. This man had saved his life, which was something. But further, he was the ideal master. Often men saw to the welfare of their dogs from a sense of duty and business expediency. He saw to the welfare of his as if they were his own children, because he could not help it. And he saw further. He never forgot a kindly greeting or a cheering word, and to sit down for a long talk with them, gas he called it, was as much his delight as theirs. He had a kind way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and resting his own head upon Buck's, of shaking him back and forth, the while calling him ill names that to Buck were love names. Buck knew no greater joy than that rough embrace and the sound of murmured oaths, and at each jerk back and forth it seemed that his heart would be shaken out of his body, so great was its ecstasy. And when released, he sprang to his feet, his mouth laughing, his eyes eloquent, his throat vibrant with unuttered sound, and in that fashion remained without movement. John Thornton would reverently exclaim, "God, you can all but speak." So John also genuinely loves Buck in return, and basically only wants to see him happy. So he roughhouses with him a little bit, which is a form of playing, and Buck really enjoys this. Buck had a trick of love expression that was akin to hurt. He would often seize Thornton's hand in his mouth and close so fiercely that the flesh bore the impress of his teeth for some time after. And as Buck understood the oaths to be love words, so the man understood this feigned bite for a caress. For the most part, however, Buck's love was expressed in adoration. While he went wild with happiness when Thornton touched him or spoke to him, he did not seek these tokens. Unlike Skeet, who was wont to shove her nose under Thornton's hand and nudge till petted, or Nig, who would stalk up and rest his great head on Thornton's knee, Buck was content to adore at a distance. He would lie by the hour, eager, alert, at Thornton's feet, looking up into his face, dwelling upon it, studying it, following with keenest interest each fleeting expression, every movement or change of feature. Or, as chance might have it, he would lie farther away to the side or rear, watching the outlines of the man and the occasional movements of his body. And often, such was the communion in which they lived, the strength of Buck's gaze would draw John Thornton's head around, and he would return the gaze, without speech, his heart shining out of his eyes as Buck's heart shone out. So Buck returns Thornton's love, but he's not a pest about it. He doesn't seek it out like the other dogs. He waits for it. They have a mutual respect. Sometimes they don't even need words or caresses. They just sit and kind of watch each other and adore each other from afar. For a long time after his rescue, Buck did not like Thornton to get out of his sight. From the moment he left the tent to when he entered it again, Buck would follow at his heels. His transient masters since had come into the Northland had bred in him a fear that no master could be permanent. He was afraid that Thornton would pass out of his life as Perrault and Francois and the Scotch half-breed had passed out. Even in the night, in his dreams, he was haunted by this fear. At such times he would shake off sleep and creep through the chill of the flap of the tent, where he would stand and listen to the sound of his master's breathing. So Buck fears losing Thornton like all of the other good people who have left his life in some way. He was taken away from the judge. Francois and Perrault left him for new orders. The Scotch half-breed left him for a fresher team. So all these people that he has come to respect and admire and feel fairly treated with, he has either been taken away from them or they have left him. So he's got these kind of abandonment issues. So he watches Thornton very closely to make sure that Thornton's not going to leave him behind. But in spite of this great love he bore John Thornton, which seemed to bespeak the soft civilizing influence, the strain of the primitive which the Northland had aroused in him remained alive and active. Faithfulness and devotion, things born of fire and roof, were his, yet He retained his wildness and wiliness. He was a thing of the wild, come in from the wild to sit by John Thornton's fire, rather than a dog of the soft Southland stamped with the marks of generations of civilization. Because of his very great love, he could not steal from this man, but from any other man in any other camp he did not hesitate an instant, while the cunning with which he stole enabled him to escape detection. So even though Buck loves Thornton, he still has these wild tendencies in him. He's just kind of suppressing them for the love of Thornton. So he won't steal from Thornton, but if it's any other person, he doesn't care. He'll steal from them and he'll take whatever he wants. His face and body were scored by the teeth of many dogs, and he had fought as fiercely as ever and more shrewdly. Skeet and Nig were too good-natured for quarreling. Besides, they belonged to John Thornton. But the strange dog, no matter what the breed or valor, swiftly acknowledged Buck's supremacy or found himself struggling for life with a terrible antagonist. And Buck was merciless. He had learned well the law of club and fang, and he never forewent an advantage to drew back from a foe, he had started on the way to death. He had lessoned from Spitz and from the chief fighting dogs of the police and mail, and knew there was no middle course. He must master or be mastered, while to show mercy was a weakness. Mercy did not exist in the primordial life. It was misunderstood for fear, and such misunderstandings made for death. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten, was the law, and this mandate, down out of the depths of time, he obeyed. So because Buck is still wild inside, he will fight any dog, except Skeet and Nig, of course, that gets in his way. And he's learned to kill or be killed, and the only dogs, like I said, he won't do this with are Skeet and Nig, because they are kind and they are Thorntons. Thornton would be hurt if Buck fought with these dogs. Not to mention, as I said before, these dogs don't want anything from him. They're not fighting for supremacy. They're not fighting to be alphas. They're just there. And Skeet, especially, is super kind and super nice to him and nurses him back to health, so he has no reason to fight with them. He was older than the days he had seen and the breaths he had drawn. He linked the past with the present, and the eternity behind him throbbed through him in a mighty rhythm to which he swayed as the tides and seasons swayed. He sat by John Thornton's fire, a broad-breasted dog, white-fanged and long-furred. But behind him were the shades of all manner of dogs, half-wolves and wild wolves, urgent and prompting, tasting the savor of the meat he ate, thirsting for the water he drank, scenting the wind with him, listening with him, and telling him the sounds made by the wild life in the forest, dictating his moods, directing his actions, lying down to sleep with him when he lay down, and dreaming with him and beyond him, and becoming themselves the stuff of dreams. So peremptorily did these shades beckon him, that each day mankind and the claims of mankind slipped further from him. Deep in the forest a call was sounding, and as often as he heard this call, mysteriously thrilling and luring, he felt compelled to turn his back upon the fire and the beaten earth around it, and to plunge into the forest and on and on. He knew not where or why, nor did he wonder where or why, the call sounding imperiously deep in the forest. But as often as he gained the soft, unbroken earth and the green shade, the love for John Thornton drew him back to the fire. Thornton alone held him. The rest of mankind was nothing. Chance travelers might praise or pet him, but he was cold under it all, and from a too demonstrative man he would get up and walk away. When Thornton's partners, Hans and Pete, arrived on the long-expected raft, Buck refused to notice them till he learned they were close to Thornton. After that he tolerated them in a passive sort of way, accepting favors from them as though he favored them by accepting. They were for the same large type as Thornton. living close to the earth, thinking simply, and seeing clearly. And ere they swung the raft into the big eddy by the sawmill at Dawson, they understood Buck and his ways, and did not insist upon an intimacy such as obtained with Skeet or Nig. So even though Buck hears the call of the wild, he's still ignoring it to be with Thornton. And at this point, he meets new people, but he only trusts them because Thornton trusts them. And he doesn't go out of his way to be friendly with them, and they understand this, so they don't go out of their way to be friendly, overly friendly with him. They just kind of leave him alone, and there's like a mutual respect going on here. For Thornton, however, his love seemed to grow and grow. He alone among men could put a pack upon Buck's back in the summer traveling. Nothing was too great for Buck to do when Thornton commanded. One day they had grub-staked themselves from the proceeds of the raft and left Dawson for the headwaters of the Tanana. The men and the dogs were sitting on the crest of a cliff which fell away straight down to naked bedrock 300 feet below. John Thornton was sitting near the edge, Buck at his shoulder. A thoughtless whim seized Thornton, and he drew the attention of Hans and Peach to the experiment he had in mind. "Jump, Buck!" he commanded, sweeping his arm out and over the chasm, and the next instant he was grappling with Buck on the extreme edge, while Hans and Pete were dragging them back into safety. So Thornton tests Buck's love and loyalty by telling him to jump off the cliff, and Buck goes to do it. And Thornton catches him at the last minute so he doesn't fall, but he sees how loyal Buck is. If Thornton asks him to do something, he'll do it, even if it means, his own death. "It's uncanny," Pete said after it was over, and they had caught their speech. Thornton shook his head. "No, it is splendid, and it's terrible, too. Do you know, it sometimes makes me afraid." "I'm not hankering to be the man that lays hands on you while he's around," Pete announced, conclusively nodding his head toward Buck. "By jingo," was Hans's contribution. "Not mineself either." It was at Circle City, ere the year was out, that Pete's apprehensions were realized. Black Burton, a man evil-tempered and malicious, had been picking a quarrel with a tenderfoot at the bar, when Thornton stepped good-naturedly between them. Buck, as was his custom, was lying in a corner, head on paws, watching his master's every action. Burton struck out, without warning, straight from the shoulder. Thornton was sent spinning, and saved himself by falling only by clutching the rail of the bar. Those who were looking on heard what was neither bark nor yelp, but a something which is best described as a roar, and they saw Buck's body rise up in the air as he left the floor of Burton's throat. The man saved his life by instinctively throwing out his arm, but was hurled backward to the floor with Buck on top of him. Buck loosed his teeth from the flesh of the arm and drove in again for the throat. This time the man succeeded only in partly blocking, and his throat was torn open. Then the crowd was upon Buck, and he was driven off, but while a surgeon checked the bleeding, he prowled up and down, growling furiously, attempting to rush in, and being forced back by an array of hostile clubs. A miners' meeting, called on the spot, decided that the dog had sufficient provocation, and Buck was discharged, but his reputation was made, and from that day his name spread through every camp in Alaska. So Buck attacks this guy in order to defend Thornton. This guy gets angry, with another man. John Thornton steps in to break up the fight, and this man, Burton, goes after John. So when he punches John and Buck senses that John's in danger, he jumps in to defend him and ends up ripping this man's throat open. So now everyone basically knows Buck's reputation, that if you mess with Thornton, you're going to get this dog after you, and nobody wants that. Later on, in the fall of the year, he saved John Thornton's life in quite another fashion. The three partners were lining a long and narrow poling boat down a bad stretch of rapids on the 40-mile creek. Hans and Pete moved along the bank, snubbing with a thin manila rope from tree to tree, while Thornton remained in the boat, helping its descent by means of a pole and shouting directions to the shore. Buck on the bank, worried and anxious, kept abreast of the boat, his eyes never off his master. At a particularly bad spot where the ledge of barely submerged rocks jutted out into the river, Hans cast off the rope, and while Thornton pulled the boat out into the stream, ran down the bank with the end in his hand to snub the boat when it had cleared the ledge. This it did, and was flying downstream in a current as swift as a mill race, when Hans checked it with the rope, and checked too suddenly. The boat flirted over and snubbed into the bank bottom, and while Thornton flung sheer out of it, was carried downstream toward the worst part of the rapids, a stretch of wild water in which no swimmer could live. Buck had sprung in on the instant, and at the end of the 300 yards, amidst a mad swirl of water, he overhauled Thornton. When he felt him grasp his tail, Buck headed for the bank, swimming with all his splendid strength. But the progress shoreward was slow, the progress downstream amazingly rapid. From below came the fatal roaring where the wild current went wilder and was rent in shreds and sprayed by the rocks, which thrust through like the teeth of an enormous comb. The suck of the water as it took the beginning of the last steep pitch was frightful, and Thornton knew that the shore was impossible. He scraped furiously over the rock, bruised across a second, and struck a third with crashing force. He clutched its slippery top with both hands, releasing Buck, and above the roar of the churning water shouted, "Go, Buck, go!" Buck could not hold his own, and swept on downstream, struggling desperately, but unable to win back. When he heard Thornton's command repeated, he partly reared out of the water, throwing his head high, as though for a last look. He turned obediently toward the bank. He swam powerfully, as was dragged ashore by Pete and Hans, at the very point where swimming ceased to be possible and destruction began. They knew at the time a man could cling to a slippery rock on the face of that driving current was a matter of minutes, and they ran as fast as they could up the bank to the point far above where Thornton was hanging on. They attached the line with which they had been snubbing the boat to Buck's neck and shoulders, being careful that it should neither strangle him nor impede his swimming, and launched him into the stream. He struck out boldly, but not straight enough into the stream. He discovered the mistake too late when Thornton was abreast of him and a bare half-dozen strokes away, while he was being carried helplessly past. Hans promptly snubbed with the rope as though Buck were a boat. The rope thus tightening on him in the sweep of the current, he was jerked under the surface, and under the surface he remained till his body struck against the bank, and he was hauled out. He was half drowned, and Hans and Pete threw themselves upon him, pounding the breath into him and the water out of him. He staggered to his feet and fell down. The faint sound of Thornton's voice came to them, and though they could not make out the words of it, they knew that he was in his extremity. His master's voice acted on Buck like an electric shock. He sprang to his feet and ran up the bank ahead of the men to the point of his previous departure. Again the rope was attached, and he was launched, and again he struck out, but this time straight into the stream. He had miscalculated once, but he would not be guilty of it a second time. Hans paid out the rope, permitting no slack, while Pete kept clear of the coils. Buck held on till he was on a line straight above Thornton. Then he turned, and with the speed of an express train headed down upon him. Thornton saw him coming, and as Buck struck him like a battering ram with the whole force of the current behind him, he reached up and closed both arms around the shaggy neck. Hans snubbed the rope around the tree, and Buck and Thornton were jerked under the water, strangling, suffocating, sometimes one uppermost and sometimes the other. Dragging over the jagged bottom, smashing against rocks and snags, they veered into the bank. Thornton came to, belly downward, and being violently propelled back and forth across a drift log by Hans and Pete. His first glance was for Buck, whose limp and apparently lifeless body Nig was setting upon a howl, while Skeet was licking the wet face and closed eyes. Thornton was himself bruised and battered, and he went carefully over Buck's body. When he had been brought around, finding 3 broken ribs, "That settles it," he announced. "We camp right here." And camp they did till Buck's ribs knitted and he was able to travel. So basically what happens is Thornton walks into the river to direct the boat that they're trying to get to go down the river, and he gets swept away. Buck jumps in and tries to help him, and the two of them almost drown. And while Thornton is holding onto a rock, Buck is able to swim, I should say, to the shore, where Hans and Pete tie a rope around him and they send him back out. The first time they send him out, he can't reach Thornton because he miscalculates and he gets dragged back and he almost drowns. And basically, they didn't have CPR back then, but they knew enough to, pat the ribs and the lungs and get the water out of him. And then when Buck hears Thornton yelling, it acts like a defibrillator that like shocks his heart back into working, and he jumps back out and he goes and he saves John. John's able to grab a hold of him, and Buck swims back to shore, and all of them get pulled back in. Both of them almost drown, and Buck puts himself in great danger to save Thornton, and he gets some injuries as a result of it. However, he loves Thornton so much, he proves that he will do anything for him, and his master's voice acts like a lifesaver to him. This is how much he cares about this person. So when we get to our short answer question, why is John Thornton an ideal master? What is it about him that makes him great for Buck and the other dogs? So I want at least 2 direct details from the reading, and one of them must be a quote. I'm finding a lot of people who are throwing in lots of details, but they're not putting in that quote. Or they're just kind of summarizing things. I want a nice race format answer. All right, with that in mind, I'm going to leave you here. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you in the next installment.